Okay. This video is gonna be a little weird because I'm gonna be looking over here because my screen is broken, but my face is not important. So I had a student who was kind of pushing me to investigate Rake files, and so I've just been learning some stuff, and I wanted to share some of that with you. This is coming from the Phase 3 Active Record Intro to Rake assignment, and did some experimentation. The Rake file was already here, and I think the starting point was just this. So the first thing that I learned was that when you do -t, you get all of the tasks that have a description attached to them, alternating here between the parentheses being implicit, like here and here, and the parentheses being explicit, because that was one of the original questions, was about colons and how does that work. And so just kind of reminding ourselves about this Ruby, um, you know, flexibility. Now, I did try to dig into the task method, and it was a little bit challenging. I did get to a couple of different things that were interesting. Um, Probably this one led me to this search, but I wasn't able to really find documentation about the expectations for the task method and what are the inputs. I kind of left that at some point. So let's see, back to our code. So a bunch of them are just kind of silly listing things. I wrote this one based on this documentation, went down and I found a public class method that seemed interesting, which is tasks, and thought I would just try putting the output of the tasks method, which I'm calling on the Rake task class, and seeing if that did anything. Let's kind of see what that looks like. I haven't done that in a while. Rake deer. Okay. And so this is just a list of, regardless of whether the description is there or not. I think I've got descriptions for everything but environment. So yeah, environment's there. But anyways, it goes through and it alphabetizes them. So you see console first, um, and then DB migrate. We've got some name spacing. And this is something that follows through in the next phase. When you're doing Rails, you'll do Rails DB drop, DB create, DB migrate. So this is a nice kind of introduction to where that structure comes from. I did some experimentation with different versions of migrate, and the original question asked was this sort of colon arrangement. What is the meaning of this? And so my hypothesis was that basically task takes an argument. And so if we think about it that way, then it would make sense to take this as a hash. And so in that way, we can turn it around. And this does work. It's interesting because the notation is this notation is actually kind of evocative of like what is actually happening, because in the text of the assignment, it talks about the fact that what this does is it runs this other task before it runs migrate. So back to our code. So when we say migrate environment, we just mean run the migrate task after you run the environment task. And so I wrote my own called rollback, and I did the opposite of creating a table, which was dropping a table. I didn't like the way it left the students DB, so I figured out a way to actually delete that file. I don't think it matters, but it was just kind of, I mean, one of the things that you see when you run Rake DB well, I got to do roll back here so we can go back to the beginning. When you run rake db migrate, you see the file appear, and that's the evidence that you have migrated and created the database. And the same thing happens in Rails when you're, as you continue on. And it's actually kind of an important thing to pay attention to, because I remember as a student and then later as a coach being kind of mystified about why migrations worked sometimes, why they didn't work other times. And part of it had to do with whether there was already an existing database there. So seeing it there, seeing it appear, seeing it disappear, I think that's nice. What the environment file does is it just requires this file. And it took me a little bit of thinking, actually, when I got to the seeds, that I realized that basically this require relative is looking at this file, and if this file contains code, it essentially kind of runs that file. So that made me kind of dig a little bit deeper into the environment file. So the environment file has some lines of code that make sense and some other ones that I didn't really understand what they were doing. So basically, if you look at the students, the students in the lib here. So this is just, there's no code written in the sense that there's things being executed. Like we look here, we see we're calling the create method on student, we're passing in these arguments. Again, we have the implicit hash brackets here. These could be rewritten as in the other notation with the symbol pointing at the, oop, that's backwards. Right, doesn't matter which way you write it. But in the environment file, we've got we got a require, we've got this is a line of code to be executed, this is a line of code to be executed. I can see why DB is important, and it helps track to this a lot of code that's in the student.rb file, which is that there's all of these references to dbcon, right? So, I mean, that could have gone into the, I could put this into my student file, I wouldn't need then to say require this and do this. But the thing that I really didn't know about was this bundler setup and bundler require. And I was just using it. I was looking for a file called bundler setup, but that's not what require means. So basically this references the gem file, and there are things that are available because of the presence of the gem file that wouldn't make sense if we didn't have them. So when I commented this out and I tried Rake console, oops, this would help if I saved it. The first error I got was, I don't know what SQLite 3 is. Well, when you look at this file, you realize, so let's follow the track here. So we're in the Rake file, we're running the task, which is to do this console task. We will first do the environment task, and then we're going to run the line of code pry.start. So what's the environment task do? Well, it requires this relative, this. So that means we're running this file. Are we going to run this file? Nothing's happening here. And then we're requiring this lib student file. Well, that's just loading up a Ruby class. And it's not trying to run any of this code. It's just saying these are all of the methods that are available to you. And then the next line is where we run into the problem. And you can see from this, the stack trace here, that's line 8 of the environment is the top line where that came from, which means it read all of this. Life was going fine. Okay, you're declaring a hash. Here's the key. Oh, what is SQLite 3? Don't know. So then I thought to myself, well, what if I just say require SQLite 3? Because if you look at the SQLite 3 documentation, I went to SQLite 3 gem and then I clicked documentation. It basically says we're able to do this kind of a line when we say require SQLite 3. So I said, well, let me just try putting require in place of this. Okay, so now still broken, but new error. Now it's like, I don't know what you mean by pry. And again, if we go to the stack trace here, rake file 52, oh, well, it doesn't know what pry is. And so then that kind of put things together for me, like, oh, bundler require is looking at the gem file and saying, basically load everything up that's in the gem file so that I have access to it. Otherwise, you're going to have to manually say, I want access to this and I want access to this. This works because the two things that I run into, the SQLite 3 and the class pry, now I have explicitly said I want through my require statements. And so now everything should be working. I also know all about this class because I said require relative. So I should be able to do things to my database like, let's just create a student. Student.create name and grade and okay. Interesting. So create method instantiates a new student, and then calls the save method. The save method basically runs this line execute, and apparently the return of that line is an empty array. I don't really know what that means. I'm kind of curious now about that, but let's go to the student.db and see if there's anything in here. Oh yeah, here we go. Ben 10. So it did get put into the database. Generally with my with a save method, I'd like to return the instance, and I don't really have a good method for that. But oh, look, this is an instance. So I'll just say student as my last line of code. And then now this should work better. So when I say student.create, now it returns the student object. Good. And if I say student.all, then I'm grabbing, I'm going to the database and I'm grabbing, yeah. Now, yeah, and this is because I'm not really translating those that basically it's when I say student.all, it's just going to grab rows of information and it's returning them to me as arrays. Later, I'm going to instantiate new student objects based on those inputs. Yeah, that's really interesting. Name, grade, ID. Yeah, fascinating. Right. So for instance, if I wanted to go a step further here, I could say, well, what's the return of this? This is array of students equals, and then basically I want to map through my array of students, and I want to create for each. Now this is basically an array, so I'm naming it as ARR, and I basically want to take student.new, and then I need to stick these in the right order, because if you look at the new method, this is not a hash. This is an ordered input, name, grade, then ID. So I'll say ARR 1 for the name, ARR 2 for the grade, and ARR 0 for the ID. And that will instantiate a new student and do that for each record in the array. Right. So now I'm going to exit out of this. Do need to save this guy. And back to the console. I'm going to create a new student, but this time it'll be somebody else. Very imaginative. Great. Benito was created. And then if I do student.all, nice, an array of student objects with the correct IDs. Yeah, awesome. So anyways, we start in the rake file. This is a great example of how there's a lot of intertwined things working in any particular repository project. And, you know, it's not necessary to understand all of those things. And because part of your job as a student is to stay focused on what's most important for you to kind of keep moving the ball down the field, to use a American football analogy. But at some point it's nice to kind of circle back and say, okay, what more do I understand? How can I play with this? What could I change to kind of check my understanding of how this is all working together? Obviously, if I require SQLite 3 and Pry, what I didn't bring in was Rake, which I don't think is a problem because I'm using this Rake command somehow. That must be accessible to me everywhere. And I don't have access to RSpec, so that could be a problem. And it'd be another thing for me to test and play around with these different groupings in the gem file and whether I can require RSpec at this level. One of the things that the environment made me think of, and this is further down the line, but in Rails and in many other coding environments, there are different environments: development, testing, and production, which is the standard flow for creating something and getting it out to the world. Getting it out to the world is the production phase. Playing around with it is the development phase. The testing phase, you interact with a lot through RSpec, and those have all been created for you so that you can kind of test the expectations that are set for you against a clear set of rules. Go to the RSpec here. Right. So this is all written in RSpec and it's got its own logic. But basically is, it's writing expectations in a language, and then you're able to test how you're doing. That often is segregated to a separate environment called the testing environment, which I don't know. I haven't done enough work in sort of the full scale development to testing to production to be able to speak as to why that's really useful. But all right, that's it. I'm headed out. Hope that was helpful.